Uh, I had a contractor doing some work downstairs, so I had to relocate up here. Anyway, and I don't know how to do the backdrop stuff, and so that's what we have. Okay, so we talked about Barbados and what happened with the islands when the Europeans were discovering the New World. They were heading out of Africa. They went due west, and they found rich, fertile soil, and they took over. They took over, and Barbados was a key spot in that it had a very rich soil and could produce sugar. Now, what's really fortuitous is that we have the events going on in Ukraine and Russia today. And I have to say that what we are witnessing, the massacres that are taking place, I'm sorry, but that is what was done to the Native Americans. And and on these islands, they were either enslaved or they were killed. And so it was a very, if you think Putin is an amoral person, the people who were invading places like Barbados were terribly amoral, and even manipulated religion to say we're opening a new door, and this is really going to be deregulation. We're declaring Protestant supremacy, so that it wasn't that what we're doing is we're embarking on an inhuman endeavor to get rich. What we're doing is promoting Protestantism. So what happens is they deplete the soil. They overproduce. They've treated people horribly. They work people to death. They have to keep bringing in more enslaved people to replace those that they've killed in the work process. And now so the people there want to kill them. And the Barbadians keep. If you go to Barbados, you'll see that as you go further inland, it gets more mountainous. And so they keep moving up the mountain to try to protect themselves from, people who are going to want to kill them for good reason. And so they are fearing for their lives. They also have depleted soils, and they're looking for different opportunities. Well, this coincides. Remember, there's a lot of history. You got to see events that simply converge together to make something happen. England had a civil war, and it's a fight between the king and the parliaments of Ireland, Scotland, and England, and and so they're having that kind of battle, and eventually King Charles gets run off, and then he's back in power, all that stuff. Well, when he's back in power, King Charles looks at the New World and says, these colonists are kind of out there on their own. There's no real cohesion between them. We don't really have much control over them. England has issued charters so that the private enterprise people can go forth and explore and conquer and all do that under the crown, but the crown isn't investing any money in it, but legally it has control, authorization over them. And so after the Civil War is done and there's restoration, King Charles looks at the colonies, and he looks at the area that we now think of as the Carolinas and Georgia, and he says, we need to stake a claim there before the French or the Spanish, who are encroaching from the west and the south, before they try to grab that land. And so King Charles wants to settle South Carolina because it's only inhabited by savages, by savages. So he kind of gets the people of Virginia to move some, explore south and establish what becomes North Carolina. He has Oglethorpe, who's going to handle the Georgia stuff. And in between is going to be South Carolina. And so what do they look for there? They look to the people who are aristocrats, powerful in England. The king wants to encourage them to lead the settlement of South Carolina. These are the Lords Proprietors. It's led by John Colton, and they craft ideas that are going to be for how to settle these different spots, and particularly South Carolina. The objective, again, is to fend off the French and the Spanish. And so they create a constitution. And what this constitution is, it's kind of a roadmap for developing. And they want to have religious freedom. They also want to be able to, deal with the native population in an unprovocative way, if that's possible. I put up the names of the Lords Proprietor because if you happen to take a trip into South Carolina, you're going to see these names all over the place. And so, this is much of what was South Carolina is created by the Lords Proprietor or the people who get recruited out of Barbados to come and settle. Mind you, the Lords Proprietor do not want to go and settle themselves in South Carolina. They simply want to organize it and reap rewards from it. And so they see the people in Barbados, depleted lands and slaves that want to kill them. Let's recruit them and see if we can encourage them to come to South Carolina. So let's take a look at that.
New Amsterdam was renamed New York in 1664 after the British took over the colony. New York and other British colonies, including Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Maryland, were societies with slaves. Of the original 13 colonies, Carolina was the first in which slavery was the center of economic production, making it the first slave society. Racial slavery was sanctioned by Carolina's 1669 Constitution.
The Carolina colony, which was originally South Carolina and North Carolina, is founded about 1670. It's one of these gifts from Charles II to his friends. Here's a place to exploit, fellas, go to it.
Many South Carolinian whites came initially from Barbados, where the British had established a giant sugar economy with some 50,000 Afro-Caribbean slaves. The plantation system was merely transplanted, like a kind of virus, from the Caribbean to the American coast.
The more slaves that you brought gave you more land. You got 50 acres of land for every person that you brought into the Carolina colony. And so slavery was encouraged from the outset here. And of course, the key was to find the type of work that slaves could do to make the colony profitable.
As the enslaved cleared land, the planters searched for a way to exploit the Carolina Low Country. They tried growing cotton and indigo and raising livestock. The more they tried, the more they failed to find a lucrative cash crop. The enslaved were growing something they called oriza, or rice, for themselves. They had grown it for hundreds of years in West Africa.
Now, it's not knowledge that they hold to themselves. Once they have shown other people how to plant this crop, they've lost control of the knowledge. And an entire economy based on exploitation of Africans is in place within a generation. and the shipment of Africans to South Carolina skyrockets.
So many of the Africans who were enslaved during the 17th and 18th century were ex-soldiers. Some of them would be captured through wars or civil wars, and these victors would sell the captives off to the Europeans. This had the advantage from their point of view of reducing their numerical strength, especially the soldier population of the opponents.
Their march to the coast. Many of them had not been to the coast before. They had not seen the ocean. They see white people for the first time. Who are these people? There was this folklore about cannibalism. Lots of slaves who were brought to the coast really were so afraid that these people were going to eat them.
Some of the people owning South Carolina are also invested in the Royal Africa Company and the slave trade themselves. They're getting a profit at both ends out of this.
The major profit came from the human cargo of enslaved Africans. Slave trading had become the basis of an international economy.
There are a variety of auxiliary industries, that is shipbuilding, insuring those ships, making sales for those ships. So the expansion of slavery then is an essential part of the expansion of capitalism.
As the ships came from West Africa and people were dying, their bodies would be thrown overboard, usually in the middle of the Atlantic. But once in a while, the captains would wait until they arrived at Charleston Harbor. So one of these captains threw several dozen overboard. And their bodies, including children, began to wash ashore. So the governor became very upset. And it wasn't because this was a crime against humanity. It was because the smell was irritating to the white population.
I just want to repeat what was the theme that I have in this, is that when we start looking at root causes of human depravity, such as we're seeing in Ukraine, I think we have to go to the heart of the disease, which was wealth, power, and greed for ever more wealth and power. And the inhumanity that is all a part of that. If we can't do something about that, we're not going to change the circumstances that today we're seeing the same, actions that took place 600 and 700 years ago. I have cut out some quotes from assorted historians, just because I think it adds something to it. And at the end, I have a clip of Professor O'Shaughnessy, whose book, An Empire Divided, is just a marvelous piece of work that highlights that the Greater and Lesser Antilles was of far greater importance to England than was the North American colonies. South Carolina was settled by Barbadians who introduced slaves, the plantation system, a slave code, speech patterns, and possibly architectural styles from the Caribbean. They had recruited, the proprietors had recruited English gentry and others for settling Carolina. And then they later recruited the Barbadians who were fearing for their lives and needed to replace depleted soils. And so they, what they had to do, though, is the proprietors had to subsidize the settlement in South Carolina, not just for a little while, but for a long while. For at least a decade, they had they had to borrow money to get them fed because they really hadn't established themselves in a way that would make it sustainable. They didn't have thoughts about how do we create a sustainable environment. It is how do we create an exploitable environment. And there was conflict over enslaving Native Americans because the Barbadians wanted to enslave the natives and they wanted to bring in slaves from Africa. The proprietors had, this is another scholar, Eugene Sermons, and he has that the proprietors had sunk nearly 10,000 pounds into Carolina without seeing a penny in return. And then they had the problem is that the colonists are kind of ignoring what it is they want to create there. And so they're ignoring instructions on debts, Indian trade, land distribution. And so they, by the end of the first decade, they're wondering if we should simply cut our losses here or try to, salvage it and reestablish it. And now from Alan Taylor, one of America's preeminent scholars, he talks about how in the 1670s, West Indian planters established the new colony on the Atlantic seaboard, north of Florida and south of the Chesapeake. By the way, if you take a vacation to Savannah, there is a tour of where slaves were brought in and where they were held in pens, for then where they would be auctioned off. This is all in the historic downtown because that's what made Savannah. And they also take you to the cotton exchange where enslaved people created the building and the metalworks in front of the building, and they will lead you into all the symbols in the metalworks correlate with a code, so that the Africans were saying, we want our freedom and all of that kind of stuff. So there's a whole story that can be told that if you don't have someone to guide you through it, you totally miss it. It's really quite fascinating. By the way, Yemen's is a golf club in outside of Charleston that's very popular. Sanjar Yemen's possessed his full share of the ruthless opportunism so characteristic of the great planter elite. On Barbados, he had murdered a political rival and a few weeks later married his widow. One of the lords concluded, if to convert all things to his present private profit be the mark of able parts, Sir John is without doubt a very judicious man. The Lord's proprietor needed experienced colonists, which Barbados promised to provide, while Carolina offered abundant land, which appealed to the frustrated ambitions of Barbadians. And so they also bring a slave code, a very harsh, brutal slave code, one that was not going to be inhibited in any way by religions that said you can't do these horrible and inhuman things to people. No, we're going to do it our way. They also want to introduce, the Barbadians want to introduce a state religion. Remember, the Lord's Proprietor first wanted freedom of religion. No, they want the Church of England. So the Church of England becomes the official church there. And they eventually established plantation owners in control. The wealthiest colonists, former West Indians, that's the people coming from Barbados, known as the Goose Creek Men. Goose Creek area right outside of Charleston, dominated the Assembly and Council of Carolina, generally to the dismay of the Lord's Proprietor, who felt increasingly ignored and defied. Between 1680 and 1695, the Lords went through 12 administrations in a futile search for a governor capable of controlling the colonists, meaning the Barbadians. from Sermons, Professor Sermons, representing the largest immigration into the colony during its first decade and contemptuous of less experienced colonists, they undertook to retain control of the provincial government and so determined the course of South Carolina's politics for almost half a century. Almost half a century? Are you kidding? It hasn't changed one bit. South Carolina, I mean, it is still a slave society. They had no sympathy for Lord Ashley's plans for Carolina. And they continued, enslaving Indians, and also were noted for trading with pirates, the pirates who were, bypassing laws of England. That's what they were doing. In a move that foreshadowed the history of South Carolina politics for the next 4 decades, the Barbadians showed an early desire to take over the provincial government. 1671, they constituted nearly half the population. So they really had, it became, Barbados 2.0. Among them were James Moore, Arthur Middleton. You didn't go visit the Middleton plantation. It's kind of presented as, isn't this glorious? Well, no, it's not. Robert Daniel, Robert Gibbs, the Gibbs Art Museums. So, I mean, when you go to Charleston or Columbia or any of those places, you're going to see these names all over, because this is what made South Carolina. Ultimately, the colonists hoped to pit the Africans against the Indians. Now, we're going to hear this again when we talk about Bacon's Rebellion. This is it, okay? The better to exploit both. In 1724, a clergyman explained that Carolinians sought to make Indians and Negroes a check upon each other, lest by their vastly superior numbers, we should be crushed by one or the other. The strategy, divide and conquer. What do you think you see going on in our contemporary politics? Okay, the slave code, referring to 2 Indian peoples, a Carolinian, cynically explained that the best policy was to hold both as our friends and assist them in cutting one another's throats without offending either. So let's, the Barbadians, as I say, they took the recruitment by the Lord's Proprietor, and they moved into South Carolina. Let's have another look at it.
One of the greatest motivations for this initial surge of migration to Carolina came through land grants. A settler would be granted by the Lord's Proprietors an initial 100 acres. And if they brought their wife and family, an additional 50 acres. And for each enslaved person, the settlers were given 100 acres each, giving the wealthy slaveholders of Barbados a tremendous advantage in staking their claim in this emerging colony.
Didn't matter how much money you had, you worked. Everybody was a worker, and they got out there and made sure things happened.
They had only one thing in mind. They had gone there to get rich.
Carolina was an investment. It was a way for them to make money.
And they brought indentured servants, and they brought enslaved Africans, and they brought the system.
Over half the white population came from Barbados itself, and more than half of the enslaved population came from Barbados.
You cannot separate the system of slavery from the economy of those early pre-colonial times. And Barbados was one of those places that helped define that economy.
The earliest slave law within an English-speaking community is the Slave Code of 1661 in Barbados. The slave law of Barbados is transferred, lock, stock, and barrel, to the Carolinas.
They took with it malaria and yellow fever. So all of those African conditions that had produced immunity in the slaves then became problematic in the Carolinas as well.
The death rate of people who first went out to any colony was pretty severe. Those who had been in an English colony in the Caribbean were seasoned in terms of what it took to make a colony work.
It was not the paradise that was proclaimed by William Hilton and others, and life was tougher, and distances were great.
They made the colony successful. And if that meant working, helping to clear the fields with their slave property, they did that. They didn't sit on the veranda sipping a mint julep.
It required a change in cultural aspects. The cultural aspects that remained, of course, were the dialect approach to how they spoke English and the institution of slavery.
They had.
And so the Lords Proprietor become the people who recruit them and set them up and subsidize them, and then they turn against them. Then the Barbadians turn against the Lords Proprietor.
With rice as a viable and profitable crop, the comparatively vast and bountiful region attracted the most successful Barbadian planters. Names that read like a who's who of South Carolina history, indelible on the state's identity.
I think if someone from Barbados came to Carolina in the 18th century, they would have felt very at home with the parish names, for instance, that are the same. Carolina was divided into parishes just like Barbados, and the names St. Philip, St. Thomas, Christ Church, St. George, St. Andrews, they're all the same names that were on Barbados. Family names like Middleton, Drayton, Colleton, Yeamans, those are names of people that were living in Carolina, and even today, Middletons and Draytons are around today in South Carolina, so it's a connection that lives on. The Middletons were early immigrants to Carolina. They were part of this group of Englishmen who established themselves on a tributary of the Cooper called Goose Creek and became a political faction called the Goose Creek Men. They were powerful English planters from Barbados. They viewed the Lord Proprietors as incompetent and selfish, and they opposed them at almost every turn.
They knew how to control commerce, and they knew international business. They knew agriculture. They were hardworking, but in a lot of ways unscrupulous. They used enslaved labor to make that money. They were not one to be told what to do. They would do the things their way. They would go up against the government.
They controlled South Carolina politics for the first 60 years or so, even after the Lord Proprietors lost control of the colony in 1719. One of their sons, Arthur Middleton, became the first rural governor of South Carolina in the 1720s.
They wanted to distinguish themselves from the ordinary Brit. They called themselves Barbadians because being a Barbadian at that point meant something.
They did live as if there were no tomorrow, and all of that comes out of the Caribbean. They have established that ethos, that ethic, and that influences settlers regardless of nationality that settle, particularly in the Low Country.
All the way through the 18th and 19th century, you've got this defiant, self-reliant way of doing things in South Carolina. They experimented. They found that lumber was needed in Barbados. They found that cattle was needed. They realized there were Native Americans that were here that could be enslaved, so they sent them down to Barbados. And today, there's communities on the island that are descendants of Native Americans from Carolina.
The Goose Creek men were determined, they were ruthless, they were very much Barbadian in that respect.
In addition to wielding the balance of power in the colony, the Goose Creek men were also known for their illegal activities, like the enslavement of indigenous peoples and engaging in commerce with pirates.
It just seems to me that once they established that system, it became systemic and it has very deep roots, and it is not very different today. I think you have to look at it that way, at least consider that. Let's have some more look at this. This sound may not be very good. I've put on the closed captioning. Let's see how it works.
The soil is fertile and rich with vitamins. What a place to vacation at, relaxing by the beach and chilling under the trees while having a drink in one's hand. However, this is now. Things were always like this, especially in the 1600s. It was 1627. English colonizers had begun to settle in Barbados, an eastern Caribbean island, to expand their territory. The primary reason for coming to Barbados was for planting sugar, so that England might avoid having to buy sugar from other European nations that produce sugar on their own Caribbean islands. The English saw how strong the demand for sugar was. Since sugar cane grew naturally on Barbados, the English saw Barbados as a lucrative opportunity. However, the Englishmen who wanted to engage in this business had to decide who to send to Barbados to grow, harvest, and process the sugarcane into refined sugar. This was not an easy task, but these Englishmen did have a number of Irish prisoners serving various sentences. They decided on a way for these Irish prisoners to work off their sentences on Barbados' sugar plantation. They sent thousands of indentured Irish prisoners to Barbados. As the years of growing and exporting these materials continued, the English began to think of a better way for the crop to be harvested and exported faster. They needed a higher efficiency route, as well as a way that was cheaper, because the Irish indentured servants did receive some form of salary, even though they were indentured. By the 1670s, African slaves, a cheaper source of labor being used throughout the Caribbean island, became the alternative to Irish indentured servants. As the English continued to expand their plantations, they began importing African slaves in increasing numbers. Between 1627 and 1807, more than 400,000 Africans, mainly originated from West Africa, had been brought to Barbados as slaves to work on sugar plantations. The English planters would request and receive more slaves whenever they believed they needed more for the plantations. The Africans were viewed as nothing more than interchangeable machine parts in the process of sugar production. The treatment experienced by the Africans was among the most inhumane in human history. Starting in 1640, Africans were thought of as inferior to Englishmen. Africans were not thought to have the capacity to be intelligent, in consideration of how dark skin color was defined as life of lesser value than light skin color. Legal codes naturally evolved out of these attitudes. Although the English were continually...
And what's important is that as the indentured Irish slaves, that population shrinks and the enslaved Africans grow, and the color of the enslaved people change from, Irish white to African black. The Barbados legal code gets changed to from Protestant supremacy to white supremacy. And then the Barbadians get recruited into South Carolina, and they bring with them white supremacy and the slave codes. So it's really important to recognize how important Barbados becomes, because it becomes imported into South Carolina, and South Carolina, then the Barbadian South Carolina, as the colonies continue growing, and the political, Georgia was going to be a penal, a debtor's prison where people would be able to redeem themselves and get back up on their feet. It was more of a liberal enterprise. The Barbadians were going to have none of that, and they undermined the Oglethorpe government, and so it becomes transformed into something more like South Carolina. Same happens in Alabama, Mississippi. That becomes the predominant model that pervades the South, which is heavily dependent on slave labor. And now I want to jump ahead into closer to the modern day. This is post-World War II. What does that, as I say, it's systemic. It's a systemic issue that emerges. Let's see what happened to a returning Black soldier to South Carolina.
On the 8 o'clock Augusta to Columbia coach that night was Sergeant Isaac Woodard, headed home to Winnsboro, South Carolina to see his wife for the first time in several years. Woodard was still in uniform, carrying a battle star for bravery under fire and a final paycheck from the U.S. Army in the extraordinary sum of $695. Enough to start the kind of life he hadn't dared dream of before the war. Like the other 900,000 African-American soldiers returning home from duty, Isaac Woodard had come to see this bright new future as his due.
African Americans had fought in all of the major wars in American history, and there's always been this theme of if we fight and we show our loyalty, then we are going to advance and be recognized as more equal citizens. And that dream had always been frustrated. But World War II was actually quite different from past wars for African Americans because it was a special kind of war.
This war, this particular war, crystallizes around the idea of this fight against fascism. And that means that it is a fight against inequality, of suppressing groups of people because of their race. So you have Black soldiers coming home, having been inculcated with the idea that America stands for something different than fascism, something different than racial and ethnic discrimination, something better.
By 10 o'clock on that February evening, Isaac Woodard was little more than an hour away from his homecoming in Winnsboro.
The atmosphere on the bus is jovial, filled with the relief that soldiers feel after surviving 15 months at war. Black soldiers and white soldiers are talking together, joking together. Eventually, a bottle of whiskey gets opened and passed around.
There were a few non-soldiers on the bus, and they were very uncomfortable with the interaction between the white and Black soldiers. There were complaints to the bus driver, and the bus driver didn't like it.
There are, of course, in 1946, no bathroom facilities on public buses. Isaac Woodard asked the bus driver if at the next stop he could be allowed to disembark and to go to the bathroom.
And the bus driver tells him, boy, go sit back down.
The bus driver cursed him. Isaac Woodard cursed him back and proclaimed his manhood.
He just said to the gentleman, you know, you don't have to speak to me in that manner. I'm a man just like you. In other words, give me respect.
Military training and service turned a Black man from the rural Deep South with a 5th grade education into a man willing to say words that he knew could put his life at risk. There was no doubt when he said that he was under any illusions about what he was saying, where he was saying it, on a bus, at night, in the Deep South. But he was a veteran. He was wearing the uniform. He was surrounded by veterans who were wearing the uniforms. They were returning from a war that they had won, and he was a stronger man because of it.
The bus driver is furious. At the next town, he goes looking for a police officer to have Woodard removed from his bus. Woodard's kind of perplexed. He steps off the bus, and as he's trying to explain himself, the police chief brings out his blackjack, which is like a baton, but it's spring-loaded and it has tremendous force, and hits Woodard over the head with it.
A soldier aboard the bus watched as the officer took Woodard by the arm and forced him around the corner and out of sight. That is the last I saw of him, he would tell investigators a few months later.
They started beating him all across the head, and they gouged his eyes out. They didn't beat him out. They put the stick in there and twisted it. They threw him in jail, and he told me they poured whiskey over him to say he was drunk. He was arrested for supposedly disorderly conduct, disturbing the peace, and being drunk. He was not drunk, he was not being disorderly, and he did not disturb the peace.
He spends the night in jail, unable to see, in excruciating pain. The next morning, he is taken to the judge. He is levied a fine, but he can't see to sign the paperwork that is put before him. Ultimately, when Woodard is examined by specialists, they determine that he will never see again. The injuries are severe and they are irreversible. He will be blind for life.
Yes, that's an anecdotal story, but I feel it is a microcosm of multiple stories like it that has that I would argue has its roots in the draconian Barbados codes for how to deal with Black people. And sadly, I'm not sure we had moved very far from there. Okay, I have one more video that I want to share with you from, well, let me bring that up. I quoted some of the works of Professor O'Shaughnessy, and I thought I'd give you a few minutes of him. Get that up there. We all know when we're asked how many colonies were there were 13. I think Professor O'Shaughnessy will say something else.
There were 26, not 13 colonies in British America. The majority of the other colonies were colonies in the Caribbean. These were places like Jamaica, Barbados, St. Kitts, Nevis, Montserrat, Dominica, and Grenada. And these colonies did not rebel at the time of the American Revolution. My interest was to find out why they didn't rebel, and also to show how important this area was during the war, and the way that this area, in fact, influenced the outcome of the American Revolutionary War. These islands, the wealth created by individual planters was actually greater than the wealth created in places like South Carolina and Virginia. It's a measure of the importance of this area that at the end of the French and Indian War, the government had to debate whether it was going to keep Canada or Guadeloupe. And when the government made negotiations to keep Canada, there was actually criticism in Parliament John Wilkes said it was like the peace of God, it passeth all understanding. But it gives you an idea of the importance of these islands, that Guadeloupe was regarded as more important than Canada. It was the Caribbean that the British had initially intended to settle, and especially Central America in the 17th century. This was where the Spanish had made their wealth with the silver trade. This is where British explorers like Sir Francis Drake and John Hawkins, they looked not to go to North America, but to South America and the Caribbean. At the end of the 17th century, this island, Barbados, and this painting almost looks like an aerial view, this was the wealthiest place in English America. It's essentially symbolic of the wealth that this small island had stone buildings. There were only 3 large stone buildings in Virginia at the time, which was then the wealthiest of the mainland colonies. This house was called St. Nicholas Abbey, and this was a planter home that was built in the late 17th century with additions during the 18th century. If you go to Speightstown in Barbados, you will again see the homes of merchants that are again built in stone and date from the late 17th century. This, and what you're seeing, is really a view of a bay, and yet this was one of the wealthiest towns in English America at the end of the 17th century, but there's nothing of it left because this was Port Royal, and in a few hours it was engulfed by a tidal wave caused by an earthquake, and it created what today is known as a cataclysmic archaeological site. That is a site where a moment of time has been almost completely preserved. Possibly the best parallel is Pompeii. We've found more pewter, for example, in excavating this area than anywhere else in English America, most of it only a few feet under water. This is the grave of a man who was fortunate enough to survive that tidal wave, rather like the story of Jonah and the whale. He was in an air bubble under water and lived to tell the story, but most were less fortunate. By the time of the American Revolution, the islands were doing less trade than the North American colonies. Most British politicians saw the future as being in America, but the islands still remained very important. The governor's palace, for example, in Spanish Town in Jamaica, is much larger than the governor's palace of any of the mainland 13 colonies. This is the governor's palace in Williamsburg, often regarded as the most important government in North America, but compare it to the governor's palace in Spanish Town, Jamaica. In fact,
okay, well, I wanted you to get a sense of the importance of Barbados, and from the British perspective in terms of what was the moneymaker, and also that what they created there was a very dark moment in the history of slavery, and that is what gets imported into South Carolina and then spreads through the rest of the South, and certainly is a very integral part of the entire American culture. Okay, George, we can open up for questions and comments.
Okay, and let's turn our videos on so Sal can see, and we'll use the raise the hand function for comments or questions. Oh, Ed.
You have to unmute, Ed. Ed, you have to unmute. Yeah, you go. No, you're muted again. If you can try and unmute again, Ed. Yeah, there we go. There we go.
Okay.
Sorry.
It's been a very well used hour. I really have enjoyed it because I never think of the British colonies as being the key to all of these Caribbean places. Earlier in the show that you had, of people who go to the Caribbean today are just holiday people. They're going to sit in the sun and do all sorts of things like sandals, and it has you never think of those places as being as important to develop the concept of the colonial system, which ultimately became our southern states. It's really been very exciting for me, and I'm very happy that my my granddog is sitting on a mat behind me while I'm sitting at my granddaughter's desk. He's not barking, so I feel very good that he enjoyed this sitting here as well. So, but no, it's seriously, as you said, what we are going to see, and hopefully not too late, is the terrorism in Ukraine and Russia. That was part of the slave code. One of the photographs showed the black slave and the result of the whipping in his back, which you think about it, but then when you actually see it, you get a pain yourself of just seeing how inhumane that is, and that's what's been happening in Ukraine, as the Russian code of civilian torture is hardly believable, and it's just sad. I can't even say anything else.
Sure.
But thank you.
Yeah, thanks. One of the things that I think is important to consider is, and this often triggers some some reactions. There are people who will say we'll never be able to solve our racial animosity. And I disagree. I think that what's happened is racial animosity has become a political tool. Just as they talked about, we want to, keep the natives fighting with the African slaves. We don't want them getting together. And we're going to talk about that when we get to Bacon's Rebellion. But mind you, even we can have solutions to racial problems, but as long as people can benefit politically by agitating racial tensions, it's going to survive. And it's trying to get people to understand when you're being manipulated to be frightened or antagonistic towards people of another race because it benefits a political agenda, that if you can resist that, we might advance, but we really haven't. And some of the people who utilize that tool for political gain may themselves not be racist. They're simply doing it out of a calculation that it will benefit them. And that is even more tragic.
What was tragic, and I'll jump back to yesterday's, when Terry showed the discussion of the eminent Senator Cruz asking hopefully our first Black American in the Supreme Court. I mean, he was like a pound of shit, pardon my French. It was so terrible, you know, and I sat with my wife again, and we were just chatting about things and how these people can continue to exist in the environment in which they're existing. It was, I can't even describe it, but Terry did such a good job yesterday. So that's a whole separate issue, but it's related.
No, it is related. It is to understand that these tools, these comments, the racial antagonism is deep in our culture, and you have to. Why I want to shed light on what some will consider ancient history is that the only way you can see it is to see that its roots go back that far.
Yeah.
And how deep, and I would say that from the standpoint of a security person, if part of what I would do would be to construct analysis of vulnerability. If I was going to attack America, how would I do it? It's not just me doing. I mean, it's the group of people that I would bring together. The lowest hanging fruit, the thing that we would all exploit, is racial animus in America. If we don't solve that problem, there are people like me who want to bring us down, who are going to exploit that. And it's the greatest vulnerability that I think America has.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
Everybody must be thinking about the rain coming in.
Oh, yes. It's already here in Dunwoody.
All right.
There's Eileen.
Eileen, hey, good afternoon.
Well, good afternoon. Yes, we're not going to get anywhere in this country until we can have the authority to teach children what the real history of this country is. When we went over, remember, we had our little outing to Montgomery,
right? Our
field trip.
Yep.
All kinds of classes, little Black children are going in there. They're not the ones that need it. It's the kids that aren't learning anything.
Yeah.
They get the Disney version, but it's how until we educate people, we're ever going to get out of this. It's just awful.
No, I think it's.
I'm so sad. I won't be around to see it.
Yeah, no, I understand. I think it's a portentous time for America, and I mean, I think it's kind of a dire situation. You know, you can come to the look when they're talking about fighting the Nazis. Just so we understand, fascism and Nazism was autocratic governments. People who want to advocate for an autocracy today need to really take a step back and think about what that means. It never ends well. I mean, these are the emperors who started the attacking of each other, beginning with the Akkadian Empire 4,350 years ago. Those were autocrats. And the brutality was the same kind of brutality we're seeing today in Ukraine. So we really need, I mean, I think it's very important to recognize that the kind of thing you're seeing on the news, if we had television cameras and the technology 4,350 years ago, that's what you would be seeing. If we had the technology for when the white settlers attacked the Native Americans in the Ohio River Valley, that's what you would be seeing. You know, this isn't a new thing. It has very deep historical roots. And unfortunately, what I think happens is we get into a moment and we think, well, if we could just assassinate Putin, everything will be over and we'll go back to living in harmony with each other. I mean, no, no, the disease is much deeper, and you must come to grips with it at some point. Yeah.
Just a reminder, everyone, no classes next week. There'll be a good chance to get a booster and to visit the Picasso exhibit. Eileen said it was great.
Let me also mention that I have a conflict with the 7th class on May the 3rd, I believe it is, or May the 4th that we have class. And so we'll have to add a week to do the final class. I have to go in and be, you know, retooled. So I have to have a procedure done. So we'll have to add a week as I miss a week, but you know, we'll send out information on that, but I just want to let you know about that. Yeah. Okay, well, any other comments or? All right, well, thanks, everybody. We'll
let me ask everyone to unmute so we can thank.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Up out of it. Good.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thank you. Susan, I understand you're getting ready to go on a trip.
Yeah, we're going to, hopefully we'll get our 4th shot Friday in preparation for departing on landing in Vienna on May 1st. Hope there's not.
Sounds good.
As we remember, Russia used to love to celebrate on May 1st. And we're headed into Europe, the neutral country of Austria.
Yeah, great. Well, good.
So,
I hope it's
Have a good day.
Okay, thanks, Ed. Thank you for coming.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll have lots to report when I get back, I'm sure.
Great.
Have
great.
a good
Well,
time.
have a great time. Yeah, I got my shot today, and it's you know, I'm sure that by tomorrow morning I'll be whimpering and crying, and you know,
Oh, no, you won't.
with a hot water bottle, you know, and I'll be a pathetic figure, but that's okay. I'd rather go through one day like that than, you know, 10 weeks with the tubes in you and all that kind of stuff. So.
For sure.
Absolutely, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, we had ours too. We have 4 shots so far.
Great. And when did you get your shot, Eileen?
CBS.
When?
Oh, I got it last Saturday.
Okay.
When did we get ours?
I didn't have any trouble, but this hasn't bothered me much, and I don't know. They said sometimes, which are negative blood types, didn't like much. I don't know. I've never felt too sick from it, and I'm grateful. I did have it, you know, once though. So but once you have it, you're not that sick. So, you know, what the heck?
Yeah, after I got my first shot, I was talking to my son who's in college now, and he said, you know, how you doing? And I said, I don't feel that good, Skip. I said, I feel so bad I can't even watch a documentary. And see, he thinks I'm a nerd. I don't know where he gets that from. So, you know, for me to be so sick I can't watch a documentary, it had to be severe.
Or unwell.
Right.
Well, thank you so much for all you do for us.
Well,
Absolutely.
Yes,
thank
you.
Yeah. I'm working on the class about the history of Earth. And, you know, it's only 6 classes. And so I'm kind of picking the things that I think are things that, at least for me, when I came to learn about them, it was significant. So I thought, okay, I'm going to pick these different spots. And there's some terrific videos out there. So I'm hoping I'll have a good array of selections for you to watch. Yeah.
Pretty interesting.
Yeah, I have one with Neil deGrasse Tyson that I think will be
he's good.
good one. But I have
Okay.
several though that I think will be a lot of fun. So, yeah.
Great.